He buried his lion cub in the rain. Months later, he heard a familiar roar behind him. The rain fell in sheets so thick they swallowed sound, and beneath the acacia tree, the old lion pressed his massive paw against the still chest of his cub. She did not move. She had not moved for hours. Her golden fur, barely grown past the spots of infancy, lay matted against ribs that no longer rose and fell. The wound on her flank, 3 jagged lines from the hyena's teeth, had stopped bleeding long ago, but the infection that followed had been invisible, silent, unstoppable. Kovu lowered his great head, his mane dripping with water, and breathed against her face one final time. The breath fogged in the cold air and disappeared. She was gone. With claws meant for killing, he began to dig into the softened earth, gouging out a grave for the smallest piece of his heart. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. The Serengeti had known drought for 3 seasons before this rain finally came, and it arrived with the violence of something long denied. Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the savanna in flashes of white and purple. The grasses, usually golden and whispering, lay flat under the deluge, transformed into rivers that snaked between kopjes and pooled in the hollows where zebras once gathered to drink dust. Kovu was 12 years old, ancient for a male lion who had survived challenges, territory wars, and the slow decline of his pride. His mane, once the color of dark honey, had silvered at the edges, and the scars across his nose and shoulders told stories he could no longer remember clearly. He had been king of this territory for 7 years, but his reign had grown quiet. His lionesses had scattered after a disease swept through 2 seasons past, taking 3 of them and leaving the others skittish, prone to wandering. Only one had remained, Amara, whose own mother had been Kovu's first queen. Amara had given birth 4 months ago, during the last gasp of the dry season, in a den carved into the base of a termite mound. 3 cubs had emerged, 2 males and a female. The males were bold, tumbling over each other with premature aggression, their eyes barely open before they were already testing their teeth on their mother's tail. But the female was different. She was the smallest, born last, and she had entered the world in silence. No cry, no struggle. Amara had licked her for long minutes before the cub finally drew breath, and even then her first sound was not a mewl, but something closer to a sigh. They named her Zuri, which meant beautiful in the old tongue the wind sometimes carried across the plains, or so Kovu imagined. Lions do not name their young the way humans do, but they know them. They know them by scent and sound, by the particular weight of a small body pressed against their ribs, by the rhythm of a heartbeat felt through fur. Kovu knew Zuri. He knew her the way he knew the position of the sun and the taste of rain before it fell. She was not strong. This was clear from the beginning. While her brothers grew fat on Amara's milk and began to explore the edges of the den within weeks, Zuri stayed close to her mother's belly, her eyes slow to open fully, her legs uncertain beneath her. The veterinary teams that sometimes passed through the conservancy in their rumbling vehicles would have called it failure to thrive. The other lions simply understood that she might not survive her first year. But Kovu watched her. In the evenings, when the pride rested in the shade of the fever trees, he would position himself near the cubs, his great body a barrier against the world. The males would climb over him, biting at his ears, their tiny growls absurd against his mass. He tolerated them with the patience of an old warrior who had nothing left to prove. But when Zuri approached, always slower, always more hesitant, something in him shifted. He would lower his head to her level and let her press her small nose against his. He would rumble, that deep sound that lions make when they are content, and she would echo it back, her voice barely a whisper. Amara noticed. She watched her mate with their daughter, and perhaps she understood what Kovu himself did not fully grasp. That this cub, this fragile thing, had claimed something in him that the strong ones never could. The males would grow and challenge and eventually leave or be driven out. That was the way of lions. But Zuri needed him. And being needed after so many years of simply being feared was a different kind of power. The attack came on a night when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the hyenas were bold with hunger. They came in a group of 7, their spotted bodies low to the ground, their laughter cutting through the darkness like broken glass. The pride was resting near a cluster of boulders, the cubs tucked between Amara's paws. Kovu had been patrolling the perimeter, marking the boundary of his territory with scent and sound, when he heard the first yip. He ran. Even at his age, even with the stiffness in his joints that came with every cold morning, he ran. The distance was not far, perhaps 200 meters, but in the darkness, with the hyenas already circling, it felt like crossing an ocean. Amara was on her feet, her body arched over the cubs, her teeth bared. 2 hyenas had already darted in, testing her defenses, and she had slashed one across the face, sending it yelping into the night. But there were too many. They worked in rotations, one group fainting while another circled behind, and Amara could not protect all sides at once. Kovu's roar announced his arrival, a sound that shook the air and sent the nearest hyenas scrambling backward. He crashed into the pack like a storm, his claws finding flesh, his jaws closing around a throat. One hyena fell, then another. The rest scattered, but not before one of them, a large female with a torn ear, lunged past Amara's guard and seized Zuri in her jaws. The cub screamed. It was a sound Kovu would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. A high, thin cry that seemed to belong to something already dying. He released the hyena beneath him and spun, but the female was already running, Zuri's small body dangling from her mouth. Kovu chased. He chased until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to buckle, and when he finally caught the hyena at the edge of a ravine, his fury was absolute. He killed her with a single bite, crushing her skull between his jaws, but the damage was done. Zuri lay in the grass, 3 deep gashes across her flank, her breathing shallow and rapid. He carried her back in his mouth, as gently as he had ever carried anything. Amara met them halfway, her eyes wide with fear, and together they returned to the den. For 3 days, Zuri fought. She nursed when Amara pressed her to the teat. She opened her eyes and looked at her father with something that might have been recognition, or might have been the unfocused gaze of a creature already slipping away. Kovu did not leave her side. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He lay with his body curved around hers, his breath warming her small form, willing his strength into her failing body. On the 4th day, the infection set in. It moved fast, faster than anything Kovu could understand. Her breathing grew labored, her eyes clouded, and on the 5th day, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Zuri exhaled one final time and was still. The grave took him an hour to dig. The rain made the soil soft, but also made it heavy, filling the hole almost as fast as he could empty it. When it was deep enough, he lifted her body, so light, impossibly light, and placed her at the bottom. He did not know why he did what he did next. Lions do not bury their dead. They leave them for the scavengers, for the cycle to continue. But Kovu pushed the earth back over her with his paws, covering the golden fur, the small face, the wound that had taken her from him. And when it was done, he lay beside the grave and did not move. Amara found him there the next morning, still motionless, his eyes open but seeing nothing. She approached slowly, pressing her body against his, and together they remained in the rain until it finally stopped. The males were gone. In the chaos of the attack, they had fled into the night, and though Amara searched for them in the days that followed, she never found them. Perhaps the hyenas had taken them. Perhaps they had simply run too far. The pride, once small, was now reduced to two, an aging king and a grieving queen. This was the proposition the savannah offered: survive together or die alone. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The weeks after Zori's death moved like water through sand, slowly, almost invisibly, but leaving everything changed. The rains continued for a time, greening the savannah and bringing the herds back from wherever they had wandered during the drought. Wildebeest dotted the horizon again, their bodies dark against the new grass, and zebras gathered at the swelling rivers with their foals pressed close. Life returned to the Serengeti, but Kovu remained in the grip of something that had no name in the language of lions. He ate only when Amara brought him food. She hunted alone now, as she had learned to do in the years when the pride was larger and she was still young, and she would drag her kills back to wherever Kovu lay and drop them at his feet. He would eat mechanically, without hunger, his movements slow and his eyes distant. Then he would return to his position near the acacia tree where Zuri was buried, and he would not move again until the next meal. Amara watched him waste. The powerful muscles that had once made him terrifying to rivals began to soften and shrink. His mane grew matted, the silver spreading further, and the fire that had burned in his eyes for 12 years dimmed to something like ash. She did not understand grief the way humans do, could not name it or analyze it, but she understood that her mate was disappearing. The body remained, but the lion inside it was somewhere else, somewhere she could not follow. She tried to reach him in the way she knew. She groomed him, her rough tongue working through the tangles in his mane. She lay beside him in the heat of the day, pressing her flank against his. She brought him the choicest parts of her kills, the liver, the heart, and dropped them before him like offerings. Sometimes he acknowledged her. Sometimes his eyes would focus for a moment, and he would touch his nose to hers, and she would hear the faintest echo of that rumble that had once meant contentment. But it never lasted. Within minutes, he would drift away again, back to whatever place his mind had gone. The territory began to shrink. Without Kovu's roars marking the boundaries, without his scent refreshed on the trees and rocks, other lions grew bold. A coalition of 2 young males, brothers by the look of them, their manes still darkening from adolescence, began to encroach from the east. They did not challenge directly. They were not yet confident enough for that, but they lingered at the edges, watching, waiting for the moment when Kovu's weakness would become undeniable. Amara knew they would come eventually. It was the way of things. Old kings fell, new kings rose. The cycle did not pause for grief. But she was not ready to abandon Kovu to that fate. So she patrolled the borders herself, leaving her scent where his should have been, roaring into the darkness with a voice that was higher than his, but still carried warning. The brothers heard her and stayed back, for now. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Amara returned from patrol to find Kovu standing. He was at the edge of the acacia's shadow, his body rigid, his head lifted toward something she could not see. She approached cautiously, not wanting to startle him, and followed his gaze. There, in the tall grass perhaps 30 meters away, a shape moved. It was small, too small to be a threat, and golden in the fading light. For one impossible moment, Amara thought she saw Zuri, risen from the grave, walking toward them through the savannah. Her heart lurched, and she froze. But as the shape emerged from the grass, she saw that it was not Zuri. It was another cub, younger, thinner, with the spots of infancy still stark against its fur. It was alone. No mother trailed behind it, no pride flanked it. It moved with the uncertain gait of something that had been walking for too long, its ribs visible beneath its coat, its eyes too large for its gaunt face. Kovu did not move as the cub approached. It stopped a few meters from him, swaying slightly, and let out a sound that was halfway between a mewl and a whimper. The sound of hunger, the sound of desperation, the sound of a creature that had nowhere left to go. In the wild, male lions often kill cubs that are not their own. It is not cruelty, it is instinct, a drive encoded in their blood over millions of years. A dead cub means the mother will come into heat again, will bear the new male's offspring, will pass on his genes instead of another's. Kovu had done it himself, long ago, when he first claimed this territory and found 2 cubs from the previous king still nursing at their mother's side. He had killed them quickly, efficiently, without malice. It was simply what was done. But that night, standing in the shadow of the tree where his own daughter lay buried, something in Kovu did not follow the old script. He looked at the strange cub, this orphan, this intruder, this small golden thing that had no right to be here. And he did not feel the urge to kill. He felt something else, something that had no name in the language of lions. He lowered his head. The cub trembled but did not run. It had no energy left for running. It simply stood there, waiting for whatever would come. And when Kovu's great nose touched its face, it let out another whimper and pressed forward, into him, against his chest, seeking warmth, seeking safety, seeking the only thing that might save it. Amara watched in silence. She did not approach, did not interfere. She understood, in some deep and wordless way, that this moment was not hers. This was between Kovu and whatever broken piece of him had recognized something in this orphan, something that perhaps looked like a second chance. The cub was female. Amara discovered this when she finally approached to examine her, sniffing along her body, assessing her condition. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and covered in small wounds, scratches from thorns, bites from insects, the accumulated damage of days alone in the wild. How she had survived this long was a mystery. Where she had come from was another. But she was alive. Against all odds, against every law of the savannah, she was alive. They did not name her. Lions do not name. But Kovu knew her. He knew her the way he had known Zuri, by scent and weight, and the rhythm of her small heart beating against his ribs when she curled beside him to sleep. And in the days that followed, something in him began to return. Not fully, not completely. The grief was still there, would always be there, a wound that would never quite heal. But alongside it now was something else. Purpose, responsibility, a reason to rise when the sun rose, to eat when food was brought, to live when living seemed impossible. He began to groom the cub. He let her climb over him the way his sons once had, though she was gentler, more hesitant. He rumbled when she pressed her nose to his, and she learned to rumble back, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. When she nursed from Amara, who had accepted her with the quiet pragmatism of a lioness who understood that the pride needed new life, Kovu watched with something that might have been pride. The brothers on the border watched too. They saw the new cub, saw the change in Kovu, and they grew bolder. Their incursions became more frequent, their roars closer, their scent marks deeper into the territory. They were testing, probing, waiting for the right moment. Imara knew it was coming. Kovu, in his way, knew it too. The wild does not allow for recovery. It does not grant time to heal. It simply presents the next challenge, the next threat, the next test, and demands that you meet it or fall. The cub grew, slowly at first. Then Amara's milk restored her strength. Her spots began to fade. Her legs grew longer. Her eyes lost the dullness of starvation and gained the brightness of youth. She played in the grass, stalking butterflies and pouncing on shadows, and when she tumbled and fell, she got up again, undaunted. She was not Zuri. She would never be Zuri. But she was alive, and she was his, and for now, that was enough. 2 months after she arrived, on a night when the stars were thick enough to cast shadows, the brothers finally made their move. Kovu heard them first. The rumble of their approach, the sound of heavy bodies moving through grass, the challenge roars that split the darkness. He rose from where he lay beside the cub and walked toward the sound, and for the first time in months, his roar answered theirs. It was not the roar of a dying king. It was the roar of a lion who had found something worth fighting for. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. The battle was brief but brutal, a collision of muscle and fury beneath a sky that offered no moonlight, only the cold indifference of stars. Kovu met the brothers at the edge of the territory, near the place where the tall grass gave way to rocky outcroppings, and for a moment the 3 lions simply stared at each other, their breath fogging in the night air, their bodies coiled with potential violence. The brothers were young, perhaps 4 years old, in the prime of their strength, their manes dark and full, their eyes bright with ambition. They had been watching for weeks, studying the weakened pride, and they believed they knew what they would find. An old lion, broken by grief, ready to fall. They believed wrong. Kovu struck first. He launched himself at the larger of the brothers, his claws finding purchase in the younger lion's shoulder, his weight driving them both to the ground. The sound of their impact was like thunder, and the dust that rose around them obscured everything for a moment, turning the battle into a chaos of snarls and shadows. The second brother circled, looking for an opening, and when he found one, he struck at Kovu's exposed flank. His claws raked across the old lion's ribs, drawing blood, but Kovu barely seemed to notice. He was lost in something older than pain, something that had been sleeping inside him since the night Zuri died, and was now finally awake. He fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself, and when the first brother broke away, limping and bleeding from a wound on his face, Kovu turned to meet the second without pause. The fight lasted perhaps 10 minutes. In the end, both brothers retreated into the darkness, their roars diminished to whimpers, their challenge unanswered. Kovu stood alone in the clearing, his flanks heaving, his body marked with new scars that would join the old ones, and he roared once more, a sound that carried across the savannah and announced to any who could hear that this territory still had a king. Amara found him there at dawn, still standing, still watching the horizon. She approached and pressed her body against his, feeling the heat of his wounds, the trembling in his muscles, the exhaustion that threatened to pull him down. But he did not fall. He turned his head to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen in months: life. They walked back to the den together, where the cub was waiting. She had heard the sounds of battle, had pressed herself into the deepest corner of the termite mound, had trembled through the night without understanding what was happening. But when Kovu appeared at the entrance, she emerged slowly, sniffing the air, reading the story written in blood and sweat on his body. And then, as if she understood that he had fought for her, she walked to him and pressed her small head against his leg. Kovu lowered himself to the ground, and the cub curled against him, and together they slept. The victory bought them time, but time in the Serengeti is a borrowed thing, never truly owned. The brothers did not return, but their presence had revealed a truth that could not be ignored. Kovu was old. The battle had cost him more than he showed. He moved more slowly in the days that followed, his breath coming harder after even short walks, and the wounds on his ribs took longer to heal than they should have. Amara watched and worried. The worry was not a word she knew, only a feeling, a tightness in her chest, an urge to stay close, a fear of what each new morning might bring. The cub, meanwhile, grew. She was 6 months old now, nearly half Amara's size. Her spots almost entirely faded to the tawny gold of adulthood. She had learned to eat meat, to track small prey through the grass, to run without stumbling, and fight without fear. She had even attempted her first real hunt, a clumsy ambush of a hare that ended in failure, but demonstrated the instincts that would one day make her a predator. She was becoming a lion. But she had also become something else, attached. Not in the way of cubs to mothers, which is born of necessity and fades with maturity, but in a way that was rarer, deeper, harder to name. She followed Kovu everywhere. When he patrolled, she walked beside him, mimicking his posture, learning the paths he took. When he rested, she rested against him, her body curved to fit the shape of his. When he roared at twilight, she tried to roar with him, her voice still high and uncertain, but growing stronger each day. Kovu allowed it, more than allowed, encouraged it in his silent way. He corrected her stance when she stalked, showed her how to read the wind, taught her the difference between the rustle of grass in the breeze and the rustle of grass that meant something was coming. He had never taught his sons these things. They had been too bold, too sure of themselves, too eager to learn through trial and error rather than guidance. But this cub, this orphan, who had arrived like a gift from a savanna that rarely gives gifts, she listened, she watched, she learned. And perhaps that was why, when the fracture came, it cut so deep. It began with a scent. The cub caught it one afternoon, while she and Kovu were resting near a waterhole that had formed after the rains. Her head lifted, her nostrils flaring, and she rose without explanation and walked toward the smell. Kovu watched her go, too tired to follow immediately, and by the time he rose and tracked her path, she had disappeared into a thicket of acacia scrub. He found her standing before another lion. It was a lioness, young, perhaps 2 years old, her body lean with the look of a recent traveler, her eyes wary but not aggressive. She bore no visible injuries, no signs of distress, but her presence here, alone, was itself a kind of wound. Young lionesses did not wander the savanna without their prides unless something had driven them out. Exile, death, catastrophe. The cub was sniffing her, circling her, and the young lioness was permitting it with the patience of an animal too exhausted to resist. There was something in the way they moved around each other, something in the intensity of the cub's attention that made Kovu's fur rise along his spine. Recognition. He did not understand it, could not have articulated it, but some part of him knew. This was not a stranger. This was someone the cub remembered, someone written into the earliest chapters of her life, before hunger and wandering and the terrible solitude that had brought her to his territory. The young lioness was her sister. They had come from a pride to the north, the cub and her sister, born to a mother who had died of disease when they were barely weaned. Their father had been killed by new males shortly after, and the sisters had fled together, two cubs alone in a world that offered them nothing but death. They had walked for days, drinking from puddles, eating insects when they could find them, growing weaker with each passing hour. And then, one night, they had become separated. A river swollen with rain, a current too strong, and the smaller cub, the one Kovu now called his own, had been swept away while her sister watched from the bank, unable to help. The sister had searched. For weeks she had searched, following the river south, calling into the darkness, hoping against hope. But hope is not enough in the wild. Eventually she had given up. She had found a small pride willing to tolerate her, had survived through the dry season, and had finally been driven out when the males changed and the new king saw her as competition for his daughters. Now she was here. Now she had found her sister again. Kovu watched the reunion unfold, watched the cubs press their bodies together, heard the sounds they made, not quite purrs, not quite cries, but something in between, something that spoke of loss and finding, and a bond that had survived against impossible odds. He should have felt joy. This was a miracle, a gift, a moment of grace in a world that offered so few. But what he felt was fear. Because the sister was looking at him now, her eyes assessing, calculating. And the cub, his cub, was looking at her. And in that look was something Kovu had never seen before. Choice. The cub had been his. She had come to him starving and alone, and he had saved her, protected her, taught her, loved her, in the wordless way that lions love. She had filled the hollow that Zarira's death had carved into his heart. She had given him a reason to live when living seemed pointless. But now there was another claim on her. An older claim, perhaps. A blood claim that Kovu could never match, no matter how deep his bond with her ran. That night, the cub did not sleep beside him. She slept with her sister, their bodies intertwined, their breath synchronized. And Kovu lay alone under the acacia tree, listening to the sounds of reunion that excluded him. The fracture had begun. In the days that followed, the dynamics of the pride shifted like sand in the wind. The sister, whom Kovu came to think of as the wanderer, was not hostile to him. She showed him the deference due to a dominant male, lowering her head when he approached, stepping aside when he passed. But she was wary, and her wariness infected the cub. The easy closeness they had shared, the lessons and the walks and the quiet hours resting together began to erode. The cub still came to him. She still pressed her nose to his in greeting, still followed him on patrol some mornings. But there was a hesitation now, a divided attention. She would look back over her shoulder at her sister, would cut their time together short to return to her, would choose to sleep beside the wanderer instead of him. Amara watched the change with the detachment of a lioness who understood pack dynamics better than any male ever could. She accepted the wanderer without enthusiasm, recognizing in her a potential hunter, a potential ally, but also a potential disruption. The pride was small enough already. Adding a new member meant sharing resources, sharing territory, sharing the cub's affection. Kovu did not know how to share. He had spent his life taking and holding, defending what was his against all challengers. But this was not a challenge he could fight, not an enemy he could defeat with claws and teeth. This was something quieter, something that crept into the space between him and the cub, like water seeping into cracks, widening them slowly until the whole structure threatened to crumble. One morning, he woke to find the cub gone.
He searched for her, following her scent through the tall grass, and found her at the edge of the territory with the wanderer. They were standing together, looking east, toward the lands from which the sister had come, the lands where their mother had died, where their father had fallen, where their story had begun. The cub turned when she heard him approach, and in her eyes he saw something that broke what was left of his heart. She was going to leave. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow. But the pull was there. The call of blood and origin and a life that had existed before him. She loved him, he did not doubt that. But she loved her sister more, or differently, or in a way that demanded something he could not give. Kovu stopped at the edge of the clearing and watched them. He did not roar. He did not approach. He simply stood there, an old lion in the morning light, feeling the weight of every year he had lived pressing down on him like the sky itself. The cub looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned away. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. The days that followed were the longest of Kovu's life, longer even than the days after Zuri died, because this time the loss was not final. The cub was still there, still present, still alive, but she was slipping away, and he could not stop it. He watched her prepare without understanding what he was watching. He saw her spending more time with the wanderer, saw them hunting together, saw them lying apart from him and Amara in the cool of the evening, their bodies close, their eyes fixed on horizons he could not see. Amara tried to comfort him in her way. She brought him food. She groomed the matted tangles from his mane. She lay beside him at night, her warmth a constant against the growing cold inside him. But she could not give him what he needed, because what she needed was something that could not be given, only chosen. 2 weeks after the wanderer's arrival, the rains returned. They came suddenly, as they often did on the Serengeti, announced by a wall of dark clouds on the western horizon and the smell of ozone sharp in the air. The pride sought shelter in the den, pressing together as the storm broke overhead, and for a few hours they were united again. Kovu and Amara, the cub and the wanderer, 4 lions huddled against the fury of the sky. When the storm passed, the world had changed. The rivers had swelled, cutting new channels through the earth, flooding the low places where the herds had grazed. The waterhole near the den had become a lake, and the paths Kovu had walked for years were suddenly impassable. But worse than the water was what it had brought. The scent hit them first, the rank, sharp smell of something that did not belong. Then the sounds, heavy bodies moving through the flooded grass, coughing roars that carried challenge and hunger in equal measure. The brothers had returned, but they were not alone. They had gathered allies, 3 more young males, nomads like themselves, drawn together by the promise of territory and females. 5 lions against 1 aging king. It was not a challenge. It was an execution. Kovu knew it the moment he saw them emerge from the reeds, their eyes fixed on him, their bodies low and ready. He knew he could not win. The math was simple. 5 to 1, young to old, strong to weakened. If he fought, he would die. And if he died, Amara would be taken, forced to submit to the new males. The cub would be killed. The wanderer, too. Everything he had built, everything he had protected would be erased in a single morning of blood. He should have run. Every instinct, every lesson of survival screamed at him to flee, to disappear into the savannah, to live another day, even if that day meant losing everything. Other males did it. Other males survived defeat and rebuilt elsewhere, found new territories, new prides, new chances at legacy. But Kovu did not run. He thought of Zuri, buried beneath the acacia tree. He thought of the night he had dug her grave in the rain, the weight of her small body in his jaws, the emptiness that had followed. He thought of the cub who had stumbled into his life when he was ready to die, who had given him a reason to keep breathing, who was even now standing behind him with her sister, watching him face the end. He thought of all the years he had lived, all the battles he had won, all the moments of peace and pain, and everything in between. And he understood, with a clarity that came only at the edge of death, that some things were worth dying for. He roared. It was not the roar of a lion hoping to intimidate. It was the roar of a lion saying goodbye. The brothers charged. What happened next would be told by the vultures and the hyenas, by the jackals that watched from the edges, and the elephants that paused their grazing to witness. It would be told in the scars left on the earth, in the blood that seeped into the mud, in the silence that followed the storm of violence. It would be told, but never fully understood, because what Kovu did that morning defied the logic of survival. He fought. He fought with everything he had left, which was not much, but was enough. Enough to slow them, enough to hurt them, enough to make them pay for every inch of ground they took. He killed one of the nomads in the first charge, his jaws crushing the younger lion's throat before the others could react. He wounded another, his claws tearing through flesh and muscle, sending the lion screaming into the reeds. And when the brothers finally brought him down, when their combined weight forced him to the earth and their teeth found his neck, he was still fighting, still snarling, still refusing to submit. But he could not win. He had known that from the beginning. The darkness came for him, warm and slow, and he felt his body growing distant, felt the pain receding like a tide going out. He thought of Amara, hoped she would escape. He thought of the cub, hoped she would remember him. He thought of Zuri, and wondered if whatever waited beyond the darkness would let him see her again. And then, through the fog of dying, he heard it. A roar. Not his own, not the brothers. Something else. Something high and fierce and achingly familiar. The cub. She had not run. She had not fled with her sister, had not abandoned him to his fate. She had watched the battle with growing horror, watched the lion who had saved her, who had loved her, fall beneath the weight of his enemies. And something inside her had broken. Or perhaps something inside her had finally become whole. She launched herself at the nearest brother, her young body a blur of gold and fury. She was not fully grown, not yet a match for an adult male, but she was fast and she was fearless, and she was driven by something that transcended instinct. She struck the brother across the face, her claws finding his eye, and he screamed and released his grip on Kova's throat. The wanderer followed. She had hesitated, had almost turned to run, but seeing her sister charge, she found her own courage. Together, the two young lionesses attacked the remaining males, a whirlwind of teeth and claws and desperate courage. It should not have worked. The males were bigger, stronger, more experienced. But they were also wounded, also tired, also shocked by the unexpected resistance. And they had come for an easy victory, not a war. One by one they fell back. The surviving nomad fled first, his wounds too severe to continue. Then the brother who had lost his eye, howling in pain and rage. The remaining brother held his ground longest, his eyes fixed on Kovus' fallen form, calculating whether the prize was worth the cost. It was not. He retreated into the reeds, his roar of frustration echoing across the flooded savanna, and the cub stood over Kovus' body, panting, bleeding from a dozen small wounds, but alive. She had saved him. Kovus did not know how long he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, feeling the warmth of the cub pressed against him, hearing her voice, that familiar rumble, calling him back from whatever distant shore he had been approaching. Hours, perhaps, or days. Time had lost its meaning.
When he finally opened his eyes fully, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of fire. Amara was there, her face near his, her tongue rough against his wounds. The wanderer stood at a distance, watching with an expression that might have been respect. And the cub, his cub, was curled against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin, her body shielding him from the cooling air. He tried to rise and failed. His wounds were severe, torn muscles, cracked ribs, bites that had gone deep. He should have been dead. By every measure of nature, he should have been dead. But he was not. The cub lifted her head and looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that had not been there before. A decision, a commitment, a promise. She was not leaving. She had chosen. And in that moment, lying broken in the mud with the sunset bleeding across the sky, Kovu understood that he had not lost her. He had never lost her. The wanderer, the blood bond, the pull of the past, none of it had been strong enough to break what they had built together. She was his daughter, not by blood, but by something deeper, by choice. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him again. But this time, it was not the darkness of death. It was the darkness of rest, of healing, of time given back by a miracle he did not deserve. The recovery was long. For 3 weeks, Kovu could barely move. The wounds closed slowly, too slowly for a lion his age, and infection threatened more than once. Amara hunted for him, bringing back kills and dropping the meat where he could reach it without rising. The cub, and it was time, Kovu realized, to stop calling her that. She was no longer a cub, but a young lioness, fierce and capable, stayed by his side almost constantly. She groomed his wounds with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so wild. She lay against him through the cold nights, sharing her warmth. She brought him water, carrying it in her mouth from the nearby pool, dropping it near his face so he could lap at the moisture. The wanderer stayed too. Whatever had passed between her and the cub during the battle, whatever unspoken conversation had occurred in the moments before they charged together, had changed things. She was no longer a visitor, a temporary presence, a reminder of a life that existed before Kovu. She was part of the pride now, bound not by blood, but by the battle they had shared. The territory contracted further. Without Kovu to patrol the borders, other predators moved in, a hyena clan from the south, a leopard who began hunting the smaller prey near the eastern Kopjes. But these were minor incursions, manageable losses. The brothers did not return. Word had spread, as word always did in the Serengeti, of what had happened. The old king who would not fall, the young lionesses who fought like demons, the pride that refused to die. Slowly, Kovu healed. The morning he rose fully to his feet, walked to the water hole and drank under his own power, the young lioness walked beside him. She did not support him. He would not have accepted that. But she was there, a golden shadow, a constant presence. And when he lifted his head from the water and looked at her, she looked back with eyes that held no uncertainty. "You stayed," he seemed to say, in the language of lions that is not spoken, but understood. "I chose," she seemed to answer.
They returned to the den together, and for the first time in months, Kovu roared at the rising sun. It was not as loud as it once was. His voice had been damaged in the fight, the injuries to his throat leaving it rougher, quieter. But it carried across the savannah nonetheless, and it was answered. First by Amara, then by the Wanderer, then, strongest of all, by the young lioness. 4 voices rising together, a pride reborn. The seasons turned. The rains gave way to dry heat, and the dry heat gave way to new rains. The herds moved in their ancient patterns, and the lions followed, hunting when they could, resting when they couldn't. Kovu's body never fully recovered. He walked with a limp now, and he tired quickly, and some mornings he could not rise at all. But he was alive. Against every expectation, against every law of the wild, he was alive. The young lioness grew into her full size, her body lean and powerful. Her mane, the small ruff that some lionesses develop, touched with the same silver that marked Kovu. She became the primary hunter of the pride, faster and more skilled than Amara, more patient than the Wanderer. She took down wildebeest and zebra, impalas and warthogs, and she always brought the first share to Kovu, dropping it at his feet with the same gesture Amara had used during his recovery. And in the spring, when the new grasses were pushing through the earth and the air smelled of rain and possibility, she did something that surprised them all. She returned from a hunt with more than meat. Behind her, following with the uncertain steps of something new to the world, came 2 cubs. Kovu saw them from his resting place beneath the acacia tree, the same tree where Zuri was buried, and for a moment he did not understand. Then he did, and the understanding struck him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, filling his eyes with something that lions do not shed, but nonetheless feel. She had mated. With whom, Kovu did not know. A nomad, perhaps, passing through, or one of the young males from a neighboring pride who had approached during the rains. It did not matter. What mattered was that she had come back. She had come home. The cubs tumbled through the grass, their spots stark against the green, their eyes wide with the wonder of everything. They were males, both of them, and they carried in their faces the faint echo of their grandfather, the broad forehead, the heavy brow, something ancient and familiar. Kovu rose. It took him longer than it once would have, his joints protesting, his muscles slow to respond. But he rose, and he walked toward the young lioness and her cubs, and when he reached them, he lowered his great head until his nose touched the smallest of the cubs, a gesture so gentle it seemed impossible from something so scarred and worn. The cub mewled and pressed forward, into him, against his chest, seeking warmth and safety and something it could not name. The cycle continued. Not as it had always been, not with Kovu as king, not with battles and challenges and the endless violence of succession. He was too old for that now, too broken, but as something else, as guardian, as teacher, as the living memory of what had been and the foundation of what would be. He taught the cubs as he had taught their mother. He showed them the paths through the territory, the places where water gathered in the dry season, the rocks where the hyenas denned and should be avoided. He corrected their stance when they stalked, praised their attempts with his deep rumble, let them climb over him and bite at his ears with their tiny teeth. And when they grew tired, when the adventures of the day were done, they curled against him and slept, their small bodies warm against his old one. The young lioness watched. Sometimes she joined them, pressing her body against Kovu's other side, completing the circle. Sometimes she simply sat at a distance, her eyes soft with something that looked like gratitude. She had been an orphan. She had been alone, starving, dying. She had stumbled into his territory with nothing, and he had given her everything: a home, a family, a father. And now, in the twilight of his life, she was giving it back. The final scene came on a morning much like the one where this story began. The rain fell in sheets so thick they swallowed sound, and beneath the acacia tree, Kovu lay with his eyes half closed, listening to the rhythm of the water on the leaves above him. The cubs were in the den with their mother and the wanderer, dry and safe. Amara was beside him, as she always was, her body pressed against his, her breath slow and steady. He was not afraid. The pain had faded to something distant, something that belonged to a body he was gradually releasing. His thoughts were clear, clearer than they had been in months, and they moved through memory like water through grass. He thought of the territory he had claimed, the rivals he had defeated, the years of dominance that had shaped the landscape of the Serengeti. He thought of Amara, his queen, his constant, the lioness who had stood beside him through everything. He thought of his sons, lost to the night, and of Zuri, buried beneath this very tree, waiting for him. And he thought of the young lioness, his daughter, his legacy, the creature who had saved him and been saved by him in return. He thought of her cubs, who would grow to be lions, who would hunt these plains and roar at these sunsets, and know nothing of the old king who had once lived here, except perhaps as a story passed down in the language of scent and silence. That was enough. That was more than enough. He closed his eyes. Amara felt him go. The change was subtle, a slowing of breath, a deepening of stillness, but she knew. She pressed closer to him, her nose against his neck, and she stayed there for a long time, even after the warmth began to fade. When the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, the young lioness emerged from the den. She walked to the acacia tree and saw what had happened, and she stood in silence for a moment that stretched into forever. Then she roared. It was not a roar of grief, though grief was in it. It was not a roar of anger, though anger was there too. It was something else, something that announced to the savannah that a king had fallen, that an era had ended, that the world was different now than it had been yesterday. It was a roar of farewell, and a roar of beginning. The cubs heard it and came running from the den, their small bodies tumbling over each other in their haste. They gathered around their mother, confused by her sound, by the stillness of the great lion who had always been there, by the change in the air that they could sense but not understand. The young lioness lowered her head and touched her nose to Kovu's face one final time. "Thank you," she seemed to say, in the language of lions. Then she turned to her cubs, gathered them close, and began the walk toward the east, where the sun was rising and the grass was golden and the savannah stretched on forever, full of danger and beauty and life. Behind her, beneath the acacia tree, the old king rested. He had buried his daughter in the rain. Months later, he had heard a familiar roar behind him, not hers, but close enough. And in the end, that had been enough to give him something he had thought was lost forever. A reason to live, a reason to love, a reason to die in peace, knowing that the story continued, even without him. The vultures came, as they always did. The hyenas circled, as they always would. But the young lioness had marked the territory before she left, her scent a warning and a claim, and they kept their distance. Under the acacia tree, beside the grave of Zuri, Kovu returned to the earth. And somewhere to the east, a young lioness roared again, her voice joined by two smaller voices, 3 lions announcing their presence to the wild. The cycle continued. The story went on. And in the Serengeti, where everything ends and everything begins,
The rain fell once more, washing the world clean.